Before I tell you what was behind that vault door, I need you to understand something about silence. Not the silence of an empty room, not the kind that follows an argument when the last word has already done its damage, but the deep, deliberate silence of a man who spent decades choosing invisibility because he understood, perhaps better than anyone around him ever gave him credit for, that the most dangerous thing a man can carry is something worth taking. My name is Franklin Marsh. I am 71 years old. I have rough hands, a modest wardrobe, a Baltimore rowhouse that sits on a block where the paint peels from the window frames every third winter, and a grandson named Leo who, on a particular Saturday morning in the middle of October, changed the entire trajectory of everything I had spent 19 years quietly building, not by doing anything dramatic, not by saying anything profound, but simply by reaching his small, curious hand behind a loose brick in my basement wall and pulling out a brass key. I want you to hold that image for a moment. A 7-year-old boy, October light cutting thin and pale through the basement's single ground-level window, the kind of light that doesn't quite illuminate anything, but makes the dust in the air visible, each particle turning slow and golden before drifting back down to settle on the old wooden shelving units, on the stacked cardboard boxes with their handwritten labels, on the concrete floor that still carries the faint memory of motor oil from a car I sold in 2004. The basement smelled the way basements always smell in old Baltimore rowhouses, like time compressed into a physical sensation, like cold stone and old paper, and something faintly metallic underneath it all, the way iron smells just before rain. Leo had come downstairs with me because Saturday mornings were ours. That was the quiet, unspoken contract between a grandfather and his grandson that nobody else in the family had thought to question, mostly because Derek and Simone were rarely awake before 10 on weekends. In those early hours before the house on Guilford Avenue came to life with its carefully curated noise, Leo would walk the 4 blocks to my row house in the pale morning cold, with his jacket half-zipped and his sneakers untied, and we would sit together in easy, comfortable quiet. It was the best part of my week. On this particular Saturday, I had been looking for a junction box cover, a small, entirely mundane piece of hardware that I was certain I had stored on the 3rd shelf near the water heater. I had been moving boxes, which meant Leo had been moving with me, because wherever I went in that basement, Leo went too. He was the kind of child who watched things carefully before touching them, who would stand very still and observe with those large, dark eyes that came from my side of the family, from my mother's side specifically, a trait Simone had never once commented on, despite commenting on nearly everything else about my grandchild with proprietary enthusiasm. He had been running his fingers along the mortar lines between the bricks on the far wall, the wall behind the water heater, the wall I had never once drawn anyone's attention to in all the years I had lived in this house, with the patient, methodical curiosity of a child who has not yet learned that some things are not meant to be found. I heard the small, dry sound of loose mortar before I heard anything else, a soft crumbling, like a biscuit breaking, then the faint, unmistakable sound of something solid shifting against brick. I turned around slowly. Leo had his small fingers curled around a brass key. He was holding it up to that thin October light, turning it back and forth, watching the way the metal caught and released the glow with the focused attention he gave to everything he found interesting. The key was not small. It was substantial, the kind of key that carries real weight, engineered for a specific purpose, rather than mass-produced for convenience. With a bow that fit cleanly between a child's thumb and forefinger, and a blade worn smooth in particular places from years of use. Those worn places telling their own quiet story about how many times those grooves had found their lock. I felt something shift inside my chest. Not panic, I want to be clear about that. Not guilt, not the cold rush of a secret being threatened. What I felt in that moment was something far more complicated, something that took me several long seconds, standing in the dust and pale light to properly identify. It was grief and relief arriving at exactly the same time, wearing each other's clothes, and underneath both of them was something I had not allowed myself to feel in a very long time. It was the sensation of being truly seen. Leo looked at me with those dark, careful eyes and asked me, in the simple, direct way that children ask things before they learn to couch curiosity in social performance, whether it was treasure. His voice was unhurried. He was not excited the way children become excited about fictional treasure. He asked with genuine, earnest curiosity, the way he asked about everything, as though the answer mattered, and he intended to take it seriously regardless of what it turned out to be. I crossed the basement floor. I crouched down to his level, my knees protesting the cold concrete the way knees do at 71, and I looked at my grandson holding that brass key in the pale October light and thought about the 19 years of silence that key represented. I thought about the early mornings on the Baltimore waterfront, when the harbor smelled of diesel and salt and cold iron, and the sky was still more black than blue above the cranes. I thought about the handshakes and signed documents, and the quiet, careful accumulation of something I had never mentioned to a single person in my immediate family. I thought about why I had never mentioned it. I thought about which of those reasons were still true, and which had quietly expired without my noticing. Then I told Leo yes, not with drama or ceremony or the theatrical weight of a revelation. I told him yes the way I told him everything, plainly, without decoration, the way you speak to someone whose intelligence you already respect. I told him it was treasure. I told him it was the most important key he would ever hold in his life. And I told him that someday soon, when the right moment arrived, I would take him to the door it opened and show him everything that lived on the other side. What I did not tell him, what I was not yet ready to tell anyone, was that behind that vault door was $11.3 million in accumulated assets, 3 commercial properties positioned along the Baltimore and Philadelphia corridor, 4 carefully structured limited liability companies, and a legal architecture so precisely designed that not a single person who had spent years looking down at me, dismissing me, mocking me in front of people who did not know my name, would ever be able to touch a single dollar of what I had built. But that story, the full story of how a man who worked the docks, who drove a used sedan with 200,000 miles on the odometer, who lived in a rowhouse with peeling window frames, built an empire in absolute silence, then watched his own son attempt to dismantle it, requires you to understand where I came from, and precisely how much I was willing to endure before I was ready to let the world see what I had made of myself. So stay with me now. This is only the very beginning of it all. There is a particular kind of humiliation that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with raised voices or pointed accusations, or the kind of confrontation that at least grants you the dignity of knowing you are being attacked. It arrives quietly, dressed in linen and expensive cologne, carrying a glass of white burgundy that costs more than most people's weekly grocery bill, and it introduces itself with a smile so practiced it has long since forgotten it is not genuine. I had been to Derek and Simone's house in Roland Park 11 times in the 3 years since they moved there. I know the number because I counted. The way a man who has spent his life measuring cargo counts things. Because precision is a habit that does not turn itself off when you cross from the professional into the personal. 11 visits. Of those 11, I had been invited to exactly 3 dinner parties. The rest were holidays, a birthday, one Sunday brunch Simone organized primarily because her mother was visiting from Connecticut and she needed a full table. I never arrived uninvited. I understood the unspoken geometry of my place in my son's life well enough to navigate it without being told. The dinner party I am describing took place on a Friday in late September, 6 weeks before Leo found the key. The occasion was, ostensibly, a celebration of Derek's promotion to Regional Vice President of Operations at the consulting firm where he had worked for 11 years. I say ostensibly because the promotion was only part of what was being celebrated. The larger part, if I am being honest about the energy in that room, was Derek and Simone themselves, the life they had assembled, the particular image of success they had constructed, and now wished to display for 12 people who were each performing their own version of the same thing, watching each other carefully while pretending not to. The house smelled like money the way some houses do, not the smell of any single thing but the aggregate of many. Fresh-cut flowers, arranged in a vase I was fairly certain was antique crystal. A candle burning somewhere that cost $45 and smelled of black fig and cashmere. The faint undernote of whatever their housekeeper used on the hardwood floors. And above all of that, the wine. 3 bottles already open on the kitchen island when I arrived, one more being decanted in the dining room. A white chilling in an ice bucket near the French doors that opened onto the back garden where landscape lighting had been positioned to illuminate the Japanese maple just so. I wore my good jacket, the navy one cleaned and pressed, with a white shirt underneath, and the dark trousers I kept for occasions that called for them. I was aware, from the moment the front door opened and I saw the guests assembled in the living room, that my good jacket was not the same category of object as the jackets the other men were wearing. I registered this quietly, without reaction, filing it away with the flat, unsentimental part of my mind that has always been more useful to me than the part that deals in feelings. Derek met me at the door with a handshake that became a half-embrace, the kind of physical greeting that manages to communicate warmth and distance simultaneously. He was wearing a jacket that likely cost more than my rowhouse's monthly mortgage payment, and he smelled of something I did not recognize but which the room seemed to receive with approval. He looked exactly like the person he was trying to be. That was the thing about Derek at 44. The seams no longer showed. Whatever discomfort he once carried at the distance between where he came from and where he now stood, he had buried it under enough polish and practice that even I, his father, could not easily locate the boy I had raised inside the man guiding me through his beautifully appointed living room. He introduced me to Simone's circle, a couple from Green Spring Valley. He was in private equity. She chaired the board of a museum, a female law firm partner, and her husband, who was something in commercial real estate. A younger couple in their mid-30s who had just returned from 3 weeks in Italy and were still wearing their tan like a personal accomplishment. And a man named Elliot, whose surname I never caught, who moved through the room with the easy authority of someone who had long since decided that every space he entered was fundamentally his own. I watched my son work those people with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that social performance and professional networking are the same activity dressed differently. He laughed at precisely the right moments. He asked questions that demonstrated familiarity with each person's field. He steered conversations toward subjects on which he could speak with authority. He was, in the social mechanics of that room, genuinely impressive, and I will say that without reservation, because the truth requires no editorial amendment from me. He was impressive and performing, and both things were entirely true. Then came the moment of introduction. We had moved to the dining table by then. I had been seated at the far end near the kitchen doorway, with Simone's mother on my left and the couple from Italy on my right. Derek sat at the head of the table, and during the first course, a roasted beet salad arranged on the plate with the precision of architectural drafting, the man named Elliot asked Derek how his father had spent his career. I watched Derek's face in the half-second before he answered. Something passed through his expression too quickly to be named, and then it was gone, smoothed away by the same practiced composure that governed everything else about his public self. And then he said it. He said his father had worked the docks. He said it with a small, accommodating smile, the kind you offer when presenting information you consider complete and mildly unfortunate. He said it without looking at me. Worked the docks. 2 words. A complete erasure, delivered between a beet salad and the main course. Elliot nodded with the polite incuriosity of a man for whom dock workers exist as an abstract category rather than as individuals with inner lives and accumulated expertise. Simone's mother offered something about the importance of honest work, which she clearly intended as graciousness, and which landed as condescension, the way that particular variety of compliment almost always does. The young woman from Italy said she found the waterfront so atmospheric and asked if I had ever watched The Wire, meaning the television program, meaning she had processed me and filed me in the appropriate drawer. I ate my beet salad. I drank my water. I had declined the wine. And I sat at the far end of my son's table with my dock worker hands folded in my lap, and I observed. I have always been good at observing. I watched the shallow current beneath every conversation, the way each person's words were shaped, not by what they actually thought, but by what they needed the room to believe about them. I watched my son perform his belonging with the careful restraint of someone who has never fully stopped being afraid he might be asked to leave. I watched Simone manage the table with invisible authority and complete, quiet intention. Not one person in that beautifully lit room knew who I was. My son had looked at 19 years of quiet, deliberate work and had chosen to make me small in front of people whose opinions he had decided mattered more than the truth. I sat with my pressed jacket and my water glass and said nothing at all. Because silence is not the same as surrender. I had always known that. I was about to count on it entirely. I found the business card on a Tuesday morning in early October, 3 weeks after the dinner party in Roland Park, and 11 days before Leo would pull the brass key from the loose brick in my basement wall. I had worn the navy jacket to the dinner, hung it carefully in my bedroom closet when I came home late that night, and had not worn it again until the morning I was preparing to go to the bank to review a quarterly statement on one of my accounts. I reached into the breast pocket for the folded slip of paper where I had written down the account number I needed, and my fingers found something else entirely, something flat and stiff and rectangular, with the slight resistance of heavy cardstock between my fingertips. The card was cream-colored, expensive stock, the kind that costs real money to produce, because the person distributing it has learned that the physical weight of a card makes an impression before a single word on it is read. The name printed on the front was Douglas Farrell. Beneath it, in clean, restrained serif type, Elder Law and Estate Planning, a Philadelphia address, a phone number. On the back of the card, written in a hand I knew as well as I knew my own, the same slight leftward lean Derek had developed when he was 8 years old, and which no teacher had ever quite managed to correct. 2 words and a figure. Cognitive eval. And what appeared to be a date from approximately 6 weeks earlier, which would have placed it in mid-August, which was precisely when Derek had begun his campaign of concern. I stood in my bedroom with that card between my fingers for a long time. I did not react with the speed that the discovery perhaps warranted, because I have never trusted decisions made in the first minutes of discovering something difficult. I read both sides of the card twice, slowly. I set it on the dresser. I walked to the kitchen, made coffee, and stood at the window looking out at the backyard, at the thin October light on the garden bed, where I had grown tomatoes every summer since 1987, where the last of this season's plants now brown and folded over in the morning cold. I let myself think. I reviewed the past 4 months with the same methodical, unhurried attention I would bring to any complex logistical problem. In August, Derek had come to me with what he called his concern about my living situation. The rowhouse, he said, had become a maintenance burden for a man my age. The stairs were a liability. He had been reading, he said, about the particular risks facing older men who lived alone. The risk of falls, of isolation, of accelerated cognitive decline in men past 70 without adequate daily stimulation and social contact. He presented all of it with the earnest, slightly forward-leaning posture of a man who genuinely believed he was performing an act of love, and I sat across from him and received it with the complete, composed stillness of a man who was already, at some deep and not yet fully articulated level, beginning to understand that love and strategy can occupy the same sentence without either one canceling the other out. He suggested I consider moving into the spare room at the house in Roland Park. It had its own bathroom, he pointed out. There would be company, structure, proximity to Leo. I would no longer be living alone on a block where my nearest neighbor was an 82-year-old woman with her own schedule and no particular reason to notice if something happened to me on a given Tuesday morning. He used that phrase, "something happened to me," with the tender, studied vagueness of someone who wants another person to conjure a specific image without being the one who has to supply it in words. I declined, politely and without offering reasons. Over the following weeks, he returned to the subject twice more, each time with a small addition to the architecture of his concern. Had I had a checkup recently? Was I still comfortable driving after dark? Had I noticed any changes in my memory or my ability to manage daily tasks? Was my sleep regular? The questions were gentle and presented with apparent warmth. They were also, I recognized with increasing and unsettling clarity, structurally identical to the preliminary documentation process of a guardianship petition. I had spent the better part of 2 decades educating myself in the legal and financial mechanisms designed to protect accumulated assets, and I knew what that particular framework looked like when it was being constructed around a person incrementally, one soft and reasonable-sounding question at a time. The business card confirmed what I had suspected but had been reluctant to name. They were building a case, not a confrontational one. Derek was too composed for confrontation, and Simone was too calculating for anything that left fingerprints. They were constructing the quiet kind, the kind that moves through notarized documents and specialist referrals and affidavits of concern, and ends with a guardianship petition naming a responsible party to manage the financial affairs of an individual deemed unable to do so competently for themselves. It is a more frequently used instrument than most people outside the legal world ever realize, and it is most effective when deployed against someone who presents on every visible surface as a modest, unremarkable elderly man with nothing significant to protect. That was the calculation. They believed the surface was the substance. And then came the information that fractured something in me I had not known was still fracturable. It came through Marcus Webb, a man I had known for 30 years, who worked as a loading supervisor at the port, and who played golf on Saturday mornings at a public course in Catonsville, with a loose rotation of men whose circles occasionally touched Derek's professional world. Marcus called me on a Wednesday evening, and his discomfort was audible in every carefully measured pause, in the way he cleared his throat before beginning, and again before the part that cost him something to deliver. He said he had been at a gathering near the golf course some weeks back. He said he thought I should hear what he had heard. Derek had described his father to a group of men as a broke old man, not with venom, Marcus was careful to say, but with something that in some ways was worse than venom, a casual, settled dismissiveness, the tone of a man referencing a minor personal fact he resolved long ago and no longer finds worth defending. A broke old man who spent his whole life on the docks and never really built anything worth talking about. Delivered flatly, delivered the way people deliver things they have accepted as simply true. Marcus asked if I was all right. I told him I was fine, and then the call ended, and I sat in my kitchen in the quiet of a Wednesday evening with 19 years of deliberate, patient, carefully constructed silence between me and the world, and I let those words arrive completely. I did not soften them. I did not reach for the charitable interpretation. I thought about the Sunday phone calls when Derek was 19 and learning what it felt like to be far from home. I thought about the Tuesday I drove 4 hours in the dark because he needed someone to sit with him. I thought about Leo's birth and the look on Derek's face in that hospital corridor. I had built the empire partly for him, for Leo, for the idea that what I left behind would be a foundation. A broke old man who never built anything. I sat with it until it had fully done what it came to do. Then I called Miriam Okafor. The quiet was finished now. It was time to move. To understand what I built, you have to understand where I built it from. And to understand that, you have to go back to the Baltimore waterfront in the early 1990s, which is a place and time that most people who did not live it would find difficult to accurately imagine. Not because it was exotic or dramatic in any cinematic sense, but because it was relentlessly, exhaustingly physical in a way that modern life has largely insulated most people from experiencing directly. It was a place where the work was constant, and the margin for error was real, and the education available to anyone willing to pay close enough attention was unlike anything a classroom had ever offered me. I started at the port in 1991, when I was 36 years old, having spent the previous 12 years moving through a series of jobs in industrial logistics, from a warehouse in East Baltimore to a freight coordination role at a mid-sized shipping company operating primarily out of the Chesapeake region. I was not new to physical labor, and I was not new to the logic of large-scale movement, to the way cargo flows through a system, the way timing and placement and the precise choreography of containers and cranes and human coordination create either efficiency or costly chaos, depending on how well the people managing it understand the variables at play. What the port gave me that I had not had before was scale, and with scale came a quality of understanding that I could not have acquired any other way. The port in those years smelled of salt and diesel and iron and something I can only describe as industrial permanence, the accumulated smell of decades of commerce conducted at the margins of land and water, of freight that had crossed oceans and arrived still carrying the scent of wherever it had originated, of machinery that ran through heat and cold and rain without pause, because the timetables of global shipping do not accommodate weather or exhaustion or the minor inconveniences of human limitation. In winter, the cold off the water had weight to it. It moved with the wind off the harbor and found the gaps in your clothing with the patient efficiency of something that had been doing this far longer than you had and intended to continue doing it long after you were gone. I wore it for 19 years, and I never once stopped finding it clarifying in ways that nothing else in my life quite matched. I learned the port the way I have always learned things that matter to me, thoroughly, without shortcuts, with the patience of someone who understands that deep knowledge cannot be rushed and that the shortcuts people take to understand a system are almost always the precise source of the mistakes they later regret. I learned the cargo classification systems and the customs documentation process and the weight tolerances of the loading equipment and the union contract provisions and the inspection schedules and the patterns of delay and efficiency that opened and closed with tides and berth availability. I learned the names of the men who knew things not written anywhere, supervisors with 30 years on the waterfront who could read weather off the water 2 hours before the instruments registered it, who knew which longshoremen held through the final hour of a double shift, and which ones had already checked out mentally even while their bodies continued moving freight. I saved carefully from the beginning, not as the result of any singular moment of inspiration, but because it was simply how I had always operated, the way my mother had operated, the way her mother before her had operated. The women in my family had understood from long necessity that the distance between what you earn and what you spend is not merely a financial calculation, but a daily philosophical statement about what you believe the future can offer and whether present discipline can shape it. I lived modestly. I drove practical cars, wore practical clothes, ate practical meals, not because I lacked imagination for the alternatives, but because I have never confused the appearance of abundance with actual durable security. Those are two entirely different things, and most people who confuse them spend the rest of their lives discovering the difference at inconvenient and costly moments. By 1997, I had enough set aside to act on what I had been quietly building toward for several years. The port had taught me something about commercial real estate that most investors arrive at theoretically from outside. I had learned it from the inside, through daily direct observation of where goods actually moved, where businesses actually needed to be positioned, which corridors in the Baltimore-Philadelphia region were structurally undervalued because they lacked the surface appeal that attracts speculative capital. I could see which of those undervalued corridors were in the early stages of quiet, structural development that reliably precedes visible growth by a decade or more. I was not a speculator. I have never been a speculator. I was a careful reader of systems, and I read this one the same way I had always read things that mattered to me, with patience, thoroughness, and without the distorting pressure of needing to be right quickly. The first property was a commercial building on a light industrial corridor in East Baltimore, acquired in 1998 for an amount the seller considered generous and that I knew, with the quiet certainty of extensive research, represented a significant undervaluation relative to what the corridor would become. I purchased it through the first of what would eventually become 4 limited liability companies, legal structures I had taken care to fully understand and established through a Philadelphia attorney whose practice centered on asset protection. The LLC was primarily a privacy mechanism. It allowed my assets to exist at a legal remove from the name Franklin Marsh, which meant that anyone who examined Franklin Marsh and found a dock worker would find exactly a dock worker and nothing more visible beneath. The second property came in 2003. The third in 2007, positioned just ahead of the financial crisis, which I had watched developing in the pattern of the numbers, the way I once watched weather building off the harbor, early, with enough distance to position correctly. I remained still and disciplined when the people around me moved in panic, because stillness is almost always the correct response to panic when you have prepared for it sufficiently. By 2010, the 4 LLCs held 3 commercial properties, a portfolio of structured financial instruments, and a total asset value that had quietly crossed $11 million without any single person outside of Miriam Okafor and my attorney holding the full picture. I chose this modest life deliberately, not as sacrifice. I need to be precise about that, because people sometimes mistake restraint for deprivation, and it was never that. I live in the rowhouse because I like the rowhouse, 29 years on that block. I know its rhythms, the sound it makes in a winter wind, the particular quality of the light on the garden in summer mornings. These things have value that no upgrade of address would improve. I drive a practical car because I am not interested in what a car communicates to strangers on the street. Wealth is quiet. Greed is loud. I have known the precise difference my entire adult life, and I have chosen accordingly every single day. What I had not fully examined was that my silence had permitted other people to fill its space with their own conclusions. The careful surface I had maintained for so long had been accepted as the whole and complete truth. A broke old man. Never built anything. The silence was ending. The only remaining question left was who controlled what came next. And I had spent too many careful years building too precise a structure to allow that question to be answered by anyone other than me. Miriam Okafor is the kind of person who does not make an impression through any particular dramatic quality, but through the accumulating weight of absolute competence encountered over time, which is, in my experience, the only kind of impression that matters or that endures. I had been introduced to her in 2007 by the same Philadelphia attorney who had helped me establish the first of my LLCs, at a point when my financial architecture had grown complex enough that I needed someone capable of maintaining a view of the whole structure simultaneously, someone who could hold 16 years of interlocking decisions in a single organized field of vision and tell me with precision where anything was vulnerable and where everything was sound. She was 53 years old when I called her on that Wednesday evening in October. She had spent the first decade of her career at one of the large Philadelphia accounting firms, the kind where the partners' names are on the door and the clients are corporations, and the work is thorough and prestigious, and almost entirely devoid of the particular kind of creative rigor that forensic accounting demands. She had left that firm in her mid-30s to build an independent practice that focused on asset protection, estate architecture, and what she called forensic financial integrity, the careful, methodical examination of financial structures to identify not just what existed, but what could be challenged, what could be attacked, and how to position against every foreseeable avenue of attack before the attack arrived. She was, in the plainest and most honest assessment I can make, the finest financial mind I have encountered in any setting, and I have encountered a considerable number. She answered on the third ring the way she almost always answered, with her name, stated cleanly, no preamble, because Miriam Okafor does not waste time on preamble when there is substance to be addressed. I told her, with the same directness she prefers, what I had found in the breast pocket of my jacket, and what I believed it signified. She did not interrupt. She did not exclaim. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone processing surprise, but the focused silence of a mind already moving through the implications in methodical sequence. Then she told me we needed to meet in person, at the bank, within the week, and that I should bring the card. We met on a Friday, at a regional bank in central Philadelphia, where I had maintained one of my primary accounts for 11 years, a private banking relationship managed through a discrete branch that handled accounts above a certain threshold and operated, intentionally, without the retail foot traffic and casual visibility of a standard branch location. The building itself was not remarkable from the outside. A converted townhouse on a side street in Center City, a brass plate beside the door, with the bank's name in letters modest enough to be missed by someone not specifically looking for them. Inside, it was quiet in the way that rooms become quiet when they are designed by people who understand that money is serious, and that seriousness requires the absence of unnecessary noise. Miriam was already there when I arrived, seated at the table in the private room they kept for account reviews, with her reading glasses on and a legal pad in front of her already bearing several lines of handwritten notes. She stood when I came in, which she always does, and we exchanged the brief, warm handshake of two people who have worked closely together for a long time and who have long since moved past the formality that usually governs professional relationships without losing the respect that keeps those relationships precise. She looked at me the way she always looked at me at the beginning of a meeting, directly, without the social lubrication of small talk, in a way that communicated clearly that we were here to work and that she was already working. I laid the business card on the table between us. She picked it up, read both sides, set it down with the particular controlled stillness of someone who has trained herself not to show her reaction to information before she has had time to fully assess it. She asked me to walk her through everything. The August conversation about the spare room, the subsequent questions about my health and cognition, the timeline of Derek's increasing engagement with the subject of my living situation and mental fitness. I walked her through it systematically, and she took notes without interrupting. And when I finished with Marcus Webb's phone call and the broke old man at the golf course, she set down her pen and looked at me across the table with an expression I had seen on her face only a handful of times in 16 years of working together. The expression of someone who has confirmed a calculation she had hoped would turn out differently. She said we needed to go to the vault. The vault was in the lower level of the building, accessible through a corridor that ran behind the main office space and ended at a door that required two separate credentials to open, a key card and a physical key, the same brass key I had been carrying in the same manner since I was first granted access to this account level 11 years prior. The vault door itself was substantial, brushed steel, heavy enough that it moved with the measured, deliberate resistance of something built to withstand not just access attempts, but the weight of consequence, the accumulated weight of whatever it had been built to protect. I had passed through this door dozens of times over 11 years, and the sound it made as it opened had never stopped registering as something significant, a physical counterpart to the internal recognition of having built something that required exactly this kind of protection. Inside, in the organized filing system Miriam and I had established and maintained together, was the complete documented picture of what 19 years of disciplined, patient, precisely structured effort had produced. 3 commercial properties with a combined current valuation of $6.2 million. A portfolio of structured financial instruments valued at $3.8 million. Additional liquid holdings and interest-bearing accounts that brought the total, as of the most recent quarterly summary, to $11.3 million, distributed across 4 limited liability companies, whose names gave no indication of their connection to each other or to me. We sat together at the small table in the vault room for nearly 2 hours. Miriam reviewed every document with the unhurried, forensic thoroughness that is the quality I have most valued in her across all the years of our professional relationship. Not the speed, not the intelligence, but the thoroughness, the refusal to accept a surface reading when a deeper reading was available. She identified 2 areas where the current structure had vulnerabilities she wanted to address, and 3 where the existing protections exceeded what any standard legal challenge would overcome. At some point, in the quiet of that vault room with the documents spread between us and the heavy door sealed against whatever world existed on the other side of it, I told her about Leo, about the Saturday mornings and the easy, comfortable quiet of them, about the brass key in his small hand and the way the October light had turned it gold, about what I had told him, that it was treasure, the most important key he would ever hold. Miriam was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she looked at me with the direct, unornamented honesty that has always been one of her most reliable qualities, and told me that we needed to make sure the treasure was still there when Leo was old enough to use it. I told her that was exactly why I had called her. We began making a plan. The plan Miriam and I began making in that vault room on a Friday afternoon in Philadelphia was not a simple one, and I want to be precise about that. Not to suggest it was more complicated than it needed to be, because unnecessary complexity is a liability rather than a strength in legal and financial architecture, but because the situation we were responding to was itself precise and layered. What we were constructing was not a defense. I want to be accurate about the word. A defense implies that someone has already breached a perimeter, and no perimeter had been breached yet. What we were constructing was a consolidation, a tightening of everything that already existed into a form so complete and so legally unassailable that the attack being slowly assembled on the other end would find, when it finally arrived, that it had nowhere to land and nothing to grip. The first order of business was the Marsh Family Trust. Miriam had been recommending for several years that I formalize the succession structure of my assets into a trust instrument, and I had agreed in principle while allowing the actual execution to remain on the near horizon of things I intended to accomplish, rather than the present reality of things already done. The business card in my jacket pocket moved it from the horizon into the immediate present. Over the 2 weeks following our meeting at the bank, Miriam worked alongside my Philadelphia attorney to draft the trust documents, a revocable living trust naming me as both trustee and grantor, establishing Leo as the primary beneficiary upon my death, and incorporating specific provisions governing the conditions under which the assets could be distributed, challenged, or modified. The language was deliberate and exhaustive. Every potential avenue of contest had been identified and addressed in the drafting. The document that resulted was 47 pages long and had been reviewed by both my attorney and a second estate law specialist, whose independent opinion Miriam had retained specifically for this purpose. Because one review on a document of this weight and consequence was not sufficient, and Miriam does not work to a standard of merely sufficient. The 4 LLCs were restructured to sit formally beneath the trust, their ownership chain clarified and documented in a manner that removed all ambiguity about the sequence of control. Each property title was verified and confirmed clean. Each financial account's beneficiary designation was reviewed and updated where existing designations left any room for interpretation. Every thread of the financial architecture was examined and, where needed, reinforced. Not because the structure had been weak, but because the difference between strong and legally unassailable is always worth the additional work when the stakes are what they were in this situation. The second front was the medical one, and this required a different kind of patience and a different quality of deliberate, methodical precision than the legal work had demanded. Derek and Simone's strategy, as I had reconstructed it from the business card, the timeline of carefully delivered concerns, and the logical requirements of a guardianship proceeding, depended in its first and most essential phase on establishing a documented record of cognitive vulnerability. Without that foundation, a guardianship petition has nothing to stand on. The law requires evidence of incapacity. Evidence of incapacity requires a paper trail, professional assessments, documented clinical observations, the accumulating weight of concern rendered into a form a court can examine. Without that paper trail, the petition is nothing more than words without support, and courts do not grant guardianship petitions on the basis of family opinion and verbal accounts alone. I intended to give them a paper trail of an entirely different kind. Over 10 days in mid-October, I scheduled and completed 4 medical appointments. My primary care physician of 12 years, who knew my health history with the comprehensiveness that a long medical relationship provides. A neurologist at Johns Hopkins specializing in cognitive assessment, who administered a comprehensive battery of evaluations covering memory, executive function, processing speed, language, and visuospatial ability, the full range of cognitive capacities that a guardianship evaluation would be required to address. A second neurologist retained independently, for the confirmation I wanted standing on its own in the record, and a psychiatrist who evaluated my mental status, my affect, my orientation, and my capacity for rational and autonomous decision-making. Each appointment was documented in the standard medical record system. Each physician's notes, each assessment score, each evaluation summary became part of a formal medical record existing independently of anything I could influence after the fact, which was precisely the architecture of the point. I was not creating documentation for my own reassurance. I was creating documentation for a proceeding I expected to arrive, in a system no opposing attorney could credibly characterize as manufactured or biased in my favor. The results across all 4 appointments were unambiguous. My primary care physician noted excellent cardiovascular health, with no current medications presenting cognitive side effects, and no clinical observations of concern. The neurological assessments placed me in the 91st percentile for men in my age cohort across the full battery, with particular strength in executive function and working memory, precisely the capacities most relevant to evaluating financial decision-making competence. The psychiatric evaluation returned a conclusion of full mental capacity, clear and lucid judgment, and no evidence of any condition impairing autonomous decision-making. The complete documentation set was copied, certified, and placed in the vault alongside the trust documents and LLC records. A second certified copy went to Miriam's office in Philadelphia. A third was placed with my attorney, sealed and dated, with instruction that it be produced the moment any legal proceeding was initiated, touching on my cognitive status or my capacity to manage my own financial affairs. Then I went home. I drove the used sedan back through the familiar turns of a route I had driven thousands of times over nearly 3 decades, back through the neighborhoods I knew, back to the rowhouse on the block with the peeling window frames that I had chosen and that I had kept, and that belonged to me entirely. I hung the navy jacket in the closet. I made a simple dinner. I watched the evening news. I went to bed at my usual time. What I want to describe honestly, because the account requires it, is what those final days of continued silence felt like from the inside. It was not easy. There is a particular tension in knowing everything and showing nothing, a tension that lives in the body rather than the mind, in the deliberate control of the voice, and the practiced ordinariness of the face you arrange when a familiar phone number appears on the screen, and you answer it, and navigate the conversation with the complete composure of a man who has nothing more pressing on his mind than the weather and what he plans to make for dinner. Derek called twice during those final days. Both times the conversation was what our conversations had become over the previous 2 years. Surface warm, careful and oblique, circling without landing. He asked how I was feeling. I told him fine, which was the truth in ways he could not yet understand. He mentioned that he and Simone had been looking into some assisted living options in the area, just to have information available, and that they had found several that received strong reviews. He said it with the same practiced gentleness he had used throughout all of it. I told him I appreciated him thinking of me. I kept my voice exactly where he expected it to be. I have always found it useful, in difficult negotiations and in life more broadly, to allow the other side to believe they are ahead, right up until the precise moment they discover they are not. It costs nothing to do this. It gains everything. The advantage was complete. All I had to do was wait for the certified letter to arrive. The certified letter was sent from my attorney's office on a Thursday morning and was delivered to the house in Roland Park the following day, a Friday, which I had not specifically planned, but which struck me afterward as an appropriate day for the kind of reckoning that cannot be postponed until Monday. The letter was formal and precise in the way that legal correspondence from competent attorneys always is. No dramatic language, no accusations, no rhetoric of any kind. It notified Derek Marsh, as a named family member, of the establishment of the Marsh Family Trust, of the formal legal restructuring of the assets held within it, of the appointment of Miriam Okafor as financial administrator, with fiduciary responsibility, and of the retention of legal counsel in connection with any proceedings that might be initiated regarding the grantor's financial affairs or cognitive capacity. It provided the name and contact information of my attorney. It provided nothing more than what the law required it to provide, which was, in context, more than sufficient. He called me that same Friday afternoon, at 3:15, while I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea. I knew it would be the same day. Derek has always responded to urgency immediately. It is one of his genuine qualities, the ability to move quickly when circumstances require it. Though, on this particular afternoon it worked against him in a way he could not have anticipated. He called while I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, the late afternoon light coming in low through the window over the sink, the way it does in November in Baltimore, the angle of it cutting across the floor in a long, pale rectangle that shifted almost imperceptibly with the movement of clouds outside. I let the phone ring twice before I answered it. Not to be dramatic, because 2 rings is simply the pace at which I normally answer the phone, but because I intended to approach this entire conversation at a pace that was entirely of my own choosing. He asked if I had received a letter from an attorney. I told him that I had received quite a lot of correspondence over the years and that he would need to be more specific. There was a pause then, brief, controlled, but audible. The pause of a man recalibrating, of someone who had expected a different tone at the other end of the line and was rapidly revising his approach. He said the letter was about a trust, about my assets. He asked if someone had been speaking to me, filling my head with ideas, making me suspicious of the people who loved me and wanted to protect me. He used the phrase filling my head, which told me everything I needed to know about where this conversation had been expected to go and what role I had been expected to play in it. I told him to continue. He did. He spoke for several minutes about his concern for me, his worry that I was being taken advantage of by people I trusted who did not have my best interests at heart, his love for me as my son, his and Simone's desire to protect me and ensure my safety and comfort in the years ahead. He spoke with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed these talking points, perhaps not consciously, not in front of a mirror, but in the way that people rehearse things they have been thinking about for a long time, the words arriving with the smooth efficiency of language that has been turned over many times internally before it is spoken aloud. He was articulate, he was organized. He said nothing that could be held against him in the literal sense. He was also, in the way I have always been able to read him, frightened. The frequency of the words was slightly higher than his normal register. The pauses between thoughts came a beat too late. The kind of latency that appears when the processing required is more intensive than the surface presentation acknowledges. His father's son in that, I suppose. We both think before we speak, but I had learned over decades to make the pause invisible. When he finished, I was quiet for a moment. Not from hesitation, from choice. Then I told him I wanted to ask him something first, before we continued. I told him I had a question about the business card. The silence that followed this was of a different quality than the pause that had come before. The earlier pause had been a thinking pause. This one was a recognition pause, the particular silence of someone who has just understood that the map they were navigating by is not accurate, that the territory is different from what they believed, and that the conversation they expected to be having is not the conversation that is actually occurring. I let the silence be what it was. I did not rush past it. I told him I knew about Douglas Farrell. I told him I knew what elder law and estate planning meant in this context, and what the notation on the back of the card meant, and when approximately the card had been placed in my jacket pocket at a dinner party in Roland Park, and why. I told him I knew about the August conversation, and the conversations that followed it, and the structure they were intended to build. I told him I had documentation of my cognitive health from 4 independent medical professionals, the most recent assessments placing me in the 91st percentile for my age cohort, the paperwork sealed and dated, and held by my attorney. I told him he was welcome to file whatever proceeding he had been considering. I told him the outcome was already determined and that the legal work had been completed before the certified letter was ever sent. He asked me how long I had known. I told him long enough. Then I told him about Marcus Webb and the golf course, and what Marcus had reported hearing from across a green on a Saturday morning in Catonsville, and I told him that the specific phrase, "broke old man who never built anything," had been conveyed to me word for word, and that I had sat with it alone in my kitchen on a Wednesday evening and allowed it to be exactly what it was, without offering it the grace it had not earned. I told him that behind the vault door in Philadelphia, at a private banking branch in Center City whose address I then provided, there were documents establishing assets of $11.3 million in value, 3 commercial properties on the Baltimore-Philadelphia corridor, 4 limited liability companies, a structured financial portfolio, all of it now formally held in the Marsh Family Trust, with Leo named as primary beneficiary, and Miriam Okafor as fiduciary administrator and my attorney on retainer in the event of any challenge. I told him that I had built all of it between 1998 and 2010, quietly, while working the docks, while driving the used sedan, while living in the rowhouse with the peeling window frames, while wearing the navy jacket to his dinner parties, and drinking water and eating beet salad at the far end of his table. I told him that a broke old man who never built anything had, in fact, built quite a lot, and that the thing he had built most carefully of all, across 19 years of absolute silence, was an architecture so complete that not one of the people who had decided to look down at him from a sufficient height would ever be able to touch a single dollar of it. There was a long silence after that, a different kind of silence from all the ones that had come before, the heavy, settling kind, the kind that arrives after something has shifted in a way that cannot be unshifted. I sat with it. I let it be what it was. I was in no hurry. I had waited 19 years. I could wait a little longer. In the weeks that followed that Friday phone call, the various moving pieces of the situation resolved themselves with the quiet, unhurried efficiency of a well-designed system doing exactly what it had been built to do. Simone's attorney, and there was one, as I had anticipated, a downtown firm that specialized in estate disputes and family law, sent a preliminary letter to my attorney 3 days after the certified letter had been delivered. My attorney responded within 24 hours with the documentation itself, the Marsh Family Trust in its 47-page form, the restructured LLC ownership records, the certified medical evaluations from 4 independent physicians, and a cover letter noting that any costs incurred defending a frivolous proceeding would be pursued against the initiating parties. No further correspondence arrived from Simone's attorney. Derek came to see me the following Saturday, not the Saturday with Leo, a different Saturday, a gray and cold one in early November, and we sat in the front room of the rowhouse, in the 2 chairs that faced the window, the way we used to sit when he was young, and Saturdays meant something simpler than they had become. He looked like a man who had not slept well in several nights, and like a man who was trying to find a way into a conversation he did not know how to begin, and I let him take his time, because I have always believed the most important things a person has to say require the most time to find their way to the surface. What he said, eventually, was that he was sorry, not with the efficiency of a man discharging an obligation, with the slow, difficult honesty of a man confronting the distance between who he had believed himself to be and what his recent actions had actually revealed. He did not make excuses, which I had not expected from him and which I respected. He said he had told himself over the years that the way he spoke about me to people in his world was not a reflection of how he actually felt, that it was a kind of social management, a way of navigating the gap between where he had come from and where he had arrived. He said he understood now that this was not an explanation, that it was the thing itself, by another name. I listened to all of it without interruption, the way I have always listened to things that matter. When he finished, I told him 2 things. The first was that the trust was the trust, and that it would not be altered or adjusted as a gesture of reconciliation, because Leo's inheritance was not a bargaining chip, and was not dependent on the state of my relationship with Leo's father. The second was that I was not unreachable, that the path back to something real between us was not closed, but that it required honesty as its foundation, and that honesty would have to be demonstrated over time, through behavior, and not established immediately through words, regardless of how sincerely those words were meant in the moment they were spoken. He nodded. He did not argue. He went home. I do not know yet what Derek will become on the other side of what happened between us. That story is still being written, and I have learned, at 71, to resist the temptation to write the endings of stories that are still in the middle of themselves. What I know is that the door is not closed, and that what goes through it, if anything does, will have been earned honestly, or it will not count. Simone I did not hear from directly. I did not expect to, and I had no particular desire for that conversation. Some accounts settle themselves by remaining unpaid, and some distances are more honest than the proximities they have replaced. 2 Saturdays after the conversation with Derek, Leo came back to the rowhouse in the early morning cold, jacket half-zipped, sneakers untied, exactly as he always arrived. I had hot chocolate on the table by the time he came through the door, the good kind made on the stove rather than from a packet, with a small amount of cinnamon the way he liked it. We sat together in the easy quiet of a Saturday morning in November, the light outside still working itself up to full brightness, the familiar sounds of the block beginning its slow weekend assembly around us. After a little while, I told Leo that I needed to tell him something important. I told him that the key he had found behind the brick in the basement, the one he had held up to the October light and asked if it was treasure, was the key to something real, something I had built over a very long time, and that I had recently made sure, with the help of people I trusted, that what it opened would belong to him someday. I told him it was called a trust, and that he did not need to understand everything about what that meant right now, but that he should understand that it was there, and that it was his, and that it had been built for him by a man who considered building it one of the most important things he had ever done. Leo sat with this, the way he sat with everything I told him, quietly, with the full weight of his attention, his dark eyes steady and serious. He asked me if I had built it from the docks. I told him yes, from the docks and from the years, from the salt air and the heavy machinery, and the precise and patient reading of a world that most people looked at and saw only its surface. He thought about this for a moment. Then he asked me if that was why my hands were rough. I told him yes, that was exactly why. He picked up his hot chocolate and held it in both hands, the way children hold warm mugs in the cold, for the heat of it, and he looked out the window at the November morning, and I looked at him looking at it, and I thought about 19 years of silence, and what it had been for, and what it had produced, and whether the accounting of it was something I could look at clearly and without regret. I could. That is the full answer. I could look at it clearly, and I found that it balanced. There is a version of this story that people tell to make a point about deception, the rich man playing poor, the secret kept and then deployed as a weapon, the dramatic reversal of fortune designed to punish and humiliate. That is not this story. What I built in silence, I built in silence, because I understood from the beginning that what is visible is what is vulnerable, and that the most important things a man constructs in his life, the things that will outlast him, the things that will matter to the people who come after him, require protection from precisely the kind of attention that would have found them had I not been careful. The silence was not deception, it was architecture. What it means to be a broke old man who worked the docks his whole life and never built anything is this: nothing. It means nothing. It is a sentence assembled by people who confused the appearance of a life with the substance of one, who looked at the surface a man chose to present and made the fundamental error of believing that the surface was all there was. I am Franklin Marsh. I am 71 years old. I have rough hands and a modest wardrobe, and a Baltimore rowhouse, and a grandson who holds a brass key and knows it is treasure. I built $11.3 million in absolute silence, and I gave it to the child who deserved it, and I did it because I understood something that the people who dismissed me never did, and perhaps never will. The quietest things are always the ones that last.